The auctioneer's gavel had barely lifted when the cowboy's voice cut through the smoke-thick air of the Salvation Creek saloon and changed the course of 3 lives forever. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the sun-scorched belly of Texas, when the town of Salvation Creek was still young enough to be desperate and old enough to know it. The land was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, red clay stretching out under a sky so wide and blue it could make a man feel both infinite and insignificant in the same breath. Cattle drives pushed through the main street twice a year, leaving behind boot-thick mud and the smell of sweat and coin. The railroad had promised to come within 5 years, and the townspeople had been hearing that same promise for a decade. Salvation Creek was the kind of place where people either built something real or buried something they wanted to forget. Cole Hadley had come to Salvation Creek with both intentions. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes not from vanity, but from years of honest labor splitting fence posts, wrestling longhorns, breaking horses that didn't want to be broken. His face carried the permanent tan of a man who spent his life under the open sky, with laugh lines at the corners of eyes that were the precise color of the Texas sky at mid-morning, a blue so clear it was almost startling set against the weathered brown of his skin. He wore a dusty trail coat the color of old leather and a hat that had survived 4 years of hard use, its brim shaped from the habit of touching it when he greeted a woman or pushing it back on his head when he was thinking hard about something. He had come to Salvation Creek 6 months ago with a deed to 300 acres of land that had belonged to his uncle, a man he'd barely known but who had apparently thought better of Cole than Cole thought of himself. The land was good land, a creek running through the northern edge, a stand of pecan trees along the south pasture, and enough flat ground in between to build something lasting. He'd spent those 6 months repairing the old farmhouse, running a modest herd of cattle, and learning the rhythms of a place that was simultaneously welcoming and watchful of newcomers. He had not come looking for love. He would have told you that plainly if you'd asked, and he would have meant it. But the evening of October 14th, 1874, was not interested in Cole Hadley's plans. The reason Cole found himself inside the Salvation Creek saloon that Tuesday evening was purely practical. He needed to speak with the land agent, who conducted most of his business from the back corner table on Tuesday evenings, and Cole had a question about the survey markers on his eastern fence line that had been bothering him for 2 weeks. He came in, nodded to the barkeep, and noticed immediately that the saloon was unusually full for a weekday night. He spotted Emmett Briggs, the land agent, at his usual table, but Emmett was watching something happening at the front of the room with the focused attention of a man who does not want to miss a word. Cole followed the man's gaze and saw the source of the commotion. Standing near the bar with the saloon owner, a thin-faced man named Gerald Peck, positioned beside them like some kind of impresario, were 2 young women. They stood close together in a way that spoke of comfort and protection, their shoulders nearly touching. The taller of the 2 had dark brown hair pinned up neatly, wearing a dress that had once been fine but had seen hard travel, a deep burgundy color that had faded at the seams. She stood straight-backed, her chin lifted with a kind of dignity that was clearly the product of great effort, her jaw set against whatever emotion was working behind her eyes. The second woman, shorter and rounder in the face, with lighter hair and a dusting of freckles across her nose, stood slightly behind the first, one hand gripping the other's wrist. Cole felt his stomach tighten in a way he recognized as wrong. Gerald Peck was speaking loudly to the assembled crowd, his thin voice carrying easily over the low murmur of men who had set down their cards and their glasses to watch. "Now, gentlemen, you all know what hardship looks like in this territory," Peck was saying. "These 2 ladies arrived on the noon stage from Abilene's sisters, as it happens, traveling alone after the unfortunate passing of their father. No family to receive them here, no funds to speak of, and winter coming on fast. What I am offering is an opportunity, a practical solution to a mutual difficulty. Cole moved to the side of the room, his jaw tight, trying to understand the full shape of what he was seeing. A man near the front, a rancher named Douglas Webb who Cole had already disliked for reasons he'd found easy to accumulate, called out, "What's the arrangement, Peck?" "Simple enough," Peck said, with the smile of a man who had already decided he was being magnanimous. "Any man willing to take one of these ladies as a wife legal and proper, I'll have the Reverend here before the week's out, will be doing a Christian service and solving a very real problem. These girls cannot stay in the hotel without funds, and I cannot house them at the saloon." Cole looked around the room. He saw the way men were looking at those two women, not the way a man looks at a future partner, not with warmth or consideration, but with the calculating eye of someone assessing livestock. He felt the anger come up slow and hot from somewhere deep in his chest. The younger of the two sisters was crying silently now, tears running down her freckled cheeks. The older one, the one with the dark hair and the straight spine and the lifted chin, reached back without looking and took her sister's hand in a firm, steady grip. She was staring straight ahead at some middle distance that was neither the room nor the people in it, and Cole understood in that moment that she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. Douglas Webb was walking forward, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, studying the two women with a slow appraisal that made Cole's hands curl. "How old are they?" Webb asked Peck. "The younger is 18 recently," Peck said. "The older is 23. Webb made a sound of consideration. He looked at the younger girl, the one who was frightened and crying, with a particular kind of interest that Cole found deeply offensive. "I'll take the youngest one," Webb said. The room stirred with the sound of men shifting and murmuring in agreement, some nodding at Webb's choice the way they might nod at a man who'd picked the better horse. Cole had already crossed half the room before he fully knew he was moving. "I'll take the oldest one," the cowboy said. The room went completely silent. Webb turned slowly, taking in Cole with the measured look of a man who was deciding how seriously to take a challenge. Several other men turned as well. Gerald Peck blinked at Cole with the expression of a man whose carefully arranged production had been interrupted by an unscheduled actor. Cole was not looking at any of them. He was looking at the young woman with the dark hair and the straight spine, who had finally shifted her gaze from that practiced middle distance and was now looking directly at him. Her eyes were a warm, deep brown, and they were searching his face with an expression he could not quite name, something between relief and suspicion and a pride that wouldn't let her take either at face value. "And who might you be?" Gerald Peck asked. "Cole Hadley," Cole said. "I own the Hadley Ranch on the eastern edge of the county. 300 acres, a working house, a herd, and a well. I believe I'm a suitable candidate." "The hell you are," Webb said, his voice dropping into something uglier. "I was here first, Hadley, and I've got more land than you, more cattle, more. You were here first with a choice that wasn't yours to make," Cole said, and something in the evenness of his voice made Webb stop. Cole was not raising his voice. He was not performing for the room. He was simply saying what was true. These are not goods to be distributed in order of arrival. If the lady is to choose a husband, then she ought to have the choosing of it. He turned to look at the older sister again. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "My name is Cole Hadley. I am not going to pretend this situation is anything other than what it is. But if you need a place to land and someone to stand beside you, I will be that without complaint or condition, and you have my word that you will be treated with every respect due to you. The choice is yours." The silence in the saloon had a quality to it now that was different from the silence that had followed his initial declaration. That first silence had been shock. This one was something more complicated, the held breath of a room full of people watching something happen that most of them couldn't have predicted. The young woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her sister and something passed between them, some quick, wordless conversation conducted entirely in the private language of two people who had grown up sharing everything. Her sister gave the smallest nod. The young woman with the dark hair looked back at Cole. "Margaret Ellison," she said. Her voice was steadier than he had expected. "My sister is Clara, and I will take you at your word, Mr. Hadley. For now." The "for now" landed with quiet precision, and Cole almost smiled. He turned to Gerald Peck. "You will leave Miss Ellison and her sister at the hotel tonight, properly paid for on my account. In the morning I will arrange to speak with Reverend Dobbins." Peck started to object on purely financial grounds, but something in Cole's expression persuaded him to swallow whatever he'd been about to say. Douglas Webb was less persuaded. "This isn't done, Hadley," Webb said quietly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "It seems fairly done to me," Cole said, and walked Margaret Ellison and her sister out of the saloon. The night air of Salvation Creek hit them like cold water, clean and sharp after the smoke and whiskey smell of the saloon. The street was quiet, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the hotel sign in the October wind. Clara Ellison, the younger sister, exhaled a shaky breath that was half relief and half sob, and Margaret put her arm around her immediately. Cole walked a few paces ahead to give them a moment, his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the dark Texas sky with its thick scattering of stars. "Mr. Hadley," Margaret said after a moment. He stopped and turned. She was looking at him with that same searching expression, but some of the forced composure had softened slightly. "I want to be honest with you. I'd appreciate that," he said. "I don't know you. And I want you to understand that while I am grateful, genuinely grateful, for what you did in there, I am not a woman who is easy to manage or easy to please, and I will not pretend otherwise to make this arrangement more comfortable. I've been told I'm stubborn and opinionated and overly forthright." "Sounds useful on a working ranch," Cole said. She blinked. Then, despite everything, despite the grief and the fear and the exhaustion that had been pressing down on her for weeks, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the possibility of one. "Good night, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Good night, Miss Ellison." He watched them go inside the hotel, and then he stood there on the dark street of Salvation Creek for a while, looking at nothing in particular, wondering what exactly he had just done and finding, to his considerable surprise, that he did not regret a moment of it. The following morning was the kind of clear-skied autumn day that made you believe in the possibility of things, the air carrying the first real bite of coming winter, but the sun still warm on your back when you turned your face to it. Cole arrived at the hotel at 8 o'clock, hat in hand, and found Margaret Ellison already waiting in the lobby. She had slept, or tried to. He could see that in the faint shadows under her eyes, but she had repaired herself as best she could, and she met him with the same steady-eyed directness that he was already, after a single conversation, beginning to think of as characteristically hers. Clara was with her. The younger girl had composed herself substantially since the night before, and she had the look of someone who had made a private decision to be brave. Cole had brought one of his hands with him, an older man named Thomas Reeves, who had worked his uncle's land and had stayed on when Cole arrived, as both a practical matter and a personal act of faith in the new owner. Thomas was in his late 50s, weathered and quiet, with a wife named Nora living in town who made the best cornbread in the county. Cole had explained the situation to Thomas that morning, and Thomas had listened without commentary until Cole was finished and then said, "Seems right," which was the longest expression of approval Thomas Reeves generally offered. They walked together to Reverend Dobbins' house, which sat at the end of the church road, a modest white-painted building with a vegetable garden that had been recently put to bed for winter. Dobbins himself was a compact, energetic man of about 50 with white at his temples and a genuine warmth that seemed to emanate from him the way heat comes off good timber. Cole had sent a message that morning explaining the basics, and Dobbins had responded with only a brief note, "Come at 9. We'll talk." They talked for almost an hour. Dobbins spoke with both Cole and Margaret separately, which Cole had not expected and which Margaret clearly appreciated. Cole sat in the small parlor with Thomas, who was reading a month-old newspaper with the thoroughness of a scholar, while Dobbins sat in his study with Margaret. When she came out, her expression was more settled. Whatever Dobbins had said to her, it had helped. Dobbins talked to Cole next, and his questions were direct and kind at the same time, which Cole found was the most difficult combination to resist. "Why did you step in?" Dobbins asked. "Because it was wrong," Cole said. "The way those men were looking at her, at both of them, it was wrong." "And now," Cole looked at the wall for a moment, "I have land and a house that needs living in. She has knowledge and capability, I can see that plainly, and a life that needs rebuilding. Those things fit together." "That's practical," Dobbins said. "Is it anything else?" Cole met the Reverend's eyes. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I'd like to find out." Dobbins nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing I've heard in a while." They arranged the marriage for the following Saturday, 1 week hence. It was a civil contract as much as a religious one, plain and practical in the frontier style, but Dobbins insisted on making it properly sacred nonetheless. In the meantime, he arranged for Margaret and Clara to stay with himself and his wife, Eleanor, rather than the hotel, which was both cheaper and considerably more respectable. Cole rode back to his ranch with Thomas that afternoon, and they rode for 3 miles in comfortable silence before Thomas finally said, "She's got a good face." "She does," Cole agreed. "Stubborn, though," Thomas added, with the tone of a man reporting objective weather conditions. "I noticed that too," Cole said, and found he was smiling. The week before the wedding was not idle. Cole drove himself hard, working the ranch with renewed purpose. He repaired the porch railing that had been threatening to give way since spring. He whitewashed the inside walls of the main room. He brought down an extra cord of wood from the pecan grove and stacked it properly against the side of the house. Thomas's wife, Nora, came out one afternoon with a wagon load of things: curtains, a good quilt, some crockery, and arranged them in the house with the confidence of a woman who has a clear vision and the will to execute it. "She'll need a proper kitchen," Nora told Cole, standing in the middle of his kitchen with her arms crossed, examining it the way a general surveys terrain. "The kitchen works," Cole said. "It works for a man who heats beans from a can," Nora said. "Which is what you've been doing." She picked up the single pot on the shelf with 2 fingers, as if presenting evidence. "I'll send out the extra Dutch oven from the house. You need proper pans, Cole Hadley." He didn't argue. He had learned that Nora Reeves was always right about these things. Margaret came to see the ranch on Thursday, 2 days before the wedding, brought out by Dobbins and Eleanor in the Reverend's wagon. Cole saw them coming up the road and went to meet them, and Margaret stepped down from the wagon and stood in the dust of his front yard and looked at the property with her full attention, the way she seemed to do everything. He watched her take it in: the house with its repaired porch and new whitewashing, the barn, the pasture where cattle grazed in the middle distance, the stand of pecan trees to the south gold-leafed in the October light, the creek visible as a gleam through the cottonwoods to the north. She turned to him after a while. "How many acres of cultivatable land?" she said. He blinked. "About 140. The rest is pasture and timber and creek bottom." "And the cattle herd?" 42 head right now. "I'd like to build to 100 by spring if the winter's reasonable." "What about crops?" "I planted winter wheat in the east field. I'm not much of a farmer, to be honest. My uncle raised cattle and I learned cattle." "I can grow things," she said, and it was not a boast but a simple statement of fact. "My father was a crop farmer in Missouri. I know wheat and corn and kitchen garden. If you have the land for it, I can work it." "The land's there," Cole said, and something shifted in the air between them, some practical recognition of fit, the way a good joint in carpentry comes together without gaps. She looked at him then with that steady brown gaze. "I want Clara close," she said. "I know she's of age and it's not my place to manage her life, but she's my sister and she just lost our father 3 weeks ago and I don't want her too far." "I'll build her something if she stays," Cole said. "Or there's the foreman's cabin. Thomas doesn't use it. He lives in town with Nora. It's small but sound. She could have that until she decides what she wants to do." Margaret looked at the small cabin beyond the barn, a 1-room structure with a good roof and a stone chimney, and then back at Cole, and the searching expression softened a degree. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," she said. "You're more practical than I expected," he returned. "Is that a compliment?" "In my understanding of the world," Cole said, "it's one of the best things you can be." She was almost smiling again. Almost. He was beginning to understand that Margaret Ellison's almost smiles were more honest than most people's full ones. Eleanor Dobbins called from the porch where she had been tactfully admiring the pecan trees, and they rejoined the others, and the afternoon passed in the easy rhythm of practical conversation and tea, and the careful, tentative business of strangers beginning to learn each other. By the time the wagon carried them back to town in the late afternoon, with the sun going orange and long-shadowed behind the hills, Cole stood in his front yard and watched them go with a feeling he couldn't name precisely, but that sat warm in his chest like a banked fire. The wedding took place on Saturday morning in the small white church at the edge of town, with Reverend Dobbins officiating and a congregation of perhaps 15 people. Thomas and Nora, Eleanor Dobbins, Clara, a few of the townswomen who had apparently heard enough of the story to feel invested in its conclusion, and old Ray Sutter from the general store, who came to most things of public interest and brought his dog. Margaret wore her burgundy dress, carefully mended and pressed. Cole wore his good coat, the dark brown one he kept for occasions, and had taken the trouble to have his boots properly blacked. He was at the altar when she came in, and when she walked down that short aisle, he watched her with the full attention he generally gave to things that mattered. She met his eyes as she reached him, and in them he saw the complex truth of the moment, the grief for her father that had not had time to settle yet, the fear of the unknown, the practical determination that was how she moved through the world, and underneath all of it, something he thought might be the very first thread of something hopeful. They said the words Dobbins asked them to say. Cole said them simply and clearly. Margaret said hers with the same precision she brought to everything, and her voice only wavered once on the word forever, in a way that was so brief only someone watching closely would have caught it. Cole caught it. He thought it was the most honest thing he had ever heard at a wedding. When Dobbins said they might seal the ceremony, Cole took Margaret's hand first, which surprised her, and he felt the small start of her fingers before they steadied. He kissed her hand rather than her lips, which surprised everyone, including himself, but it felt right respectful of the distance that still existed between them, acknowledging without rushing. She looked up at him after with an expression he had not seen from her before, something unguarded and briefly startled. Nora cried, which she would have denied vigorously if asked. The small reception afterward was held at the Dobbins house, with Eleanor's cooking and Nora's cornbread, and enough warmth to make the autumn afternoon feel like the beginning of something rather than the end. Clara stayed close to Margaret for most of it, the two of them with their heads together in the way of sisters. But Cole noticed that Clara watched him throughout the afternoon with the careful evaluating look of a younger sibling reserving final judgment. Brought her a plate of food at one point and said simply, "Your sister told me you've been through a hard few weeks. I'm sorry about your father." Clara looked at the plate and then at him. "She told you about him." "A little," Cole said. "Crop farmer from Missouri. She clearly learned from him." Clara's expression shifted. "He was a good man," she said. "He just got sick, fever. It was very fast." "I'm sorry," Cole said again. Clara studied him for another moment with those evaluating eyes. "She's not simple," she said. "Margaret. She acts like she's practical and straightforward, but she feels things very deeply. She just doesn't always show it." "I'm beginning to understand that," Cole said. Clara nodded, as if something had been decided. "Good," she said, and picked up the plate. They drove home to the ranch in the late afternoon in Cole's wagon, with Clara riding alongside on the spare horse. The conversation on the drive was easy and occasional, the comfortable kind that doesn't require filling every silence. When they arrived and Cole helped Margaret down from the wagon, he held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she let him. The evening was quiet. Clara settled into the foreman's cabin with genuine appreciation for its solitude and coziness. Cole and Margaret had dinner together at the kitchen table. She had brought a few things from Alina's kitchen, a pot of stew and fresh bread, and they talked for 2 hours about things that mattered, about the ranch and its possibilities, about Missouri and the life she had led there, about his uncle and the land and the story of how Cole had come to be here. "Did you have anyone before this?" she asked at one point, directly and without apology. "I was close to marriage once," he said. "About 4 years ago. She chose another man in the end, a man with more to offer than I had at the time." "That must have hurt," Margaret said. "It did," he said honestly, "for a while. And then less, and then it just became part of the story of how things went. No," she said. "There wasn't time or occasion in Missouri. There were boys who were interested, but father needed me on the farm, and then he got sick," and she stopped, looking at her hands around her coffee cup. "There wasn't time." They sat in comfortable, understanding silence for a moment. "Tell me about your father," Cole said, and she did. For a long time she talked about Richard Ellison, the way he had moved through his fields with a quiet certainty, the way he had taught her to read soil by touch, the way he had told her on the night he got sick that the most important thing she could do for herself was find solid ground and build on it. By the time the fire in the hearth had burned low, they were both tired in the way that comes after real conversation, the kind of tired that feels like accomplishment. Cole showed Margaret to the main bedroom. He had aired it properly and put on the good quilt Nora had brought, and told her he would sleep in the small room off the back. She looked at him for a moment in the doorway of the bedroom. "This is a strange kind of beginning," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I'm not sure whether to be frightened by how strange it is or relieved." "I'd vote for relieved," Cole said, "but I understand the case for frightened." She almost smiled again. That almost smile that was already working its way into the permanent furniture of his mind. "Good night, Cole," she said, trying the name for the first time and looking slightly surprised at herself. "Good night, Margaret," he said. In the weeks that followed, Salvation Creek watched the Hadley Ranch with the particular interest that small towns reserve for arrangements they were not entirely sure would work out. People made their assessments and traded them over dry goods and fence lines. The general consensus seemed to be cautious optimism tempered by the awareness that unusual beginnings could go either very well or very badly, and it was interesting to watch either outcome. What happened was this: it went very well. Not instantly. Not smoothly, but with the honest, gradual rightness of two capable people who were learning that their particular capabilities fit together in ways neither had anticipated. Margaret Ellison, Margaret Hadley, though it took her some weeks to stop correcting herself when she heard it was extraordinary on the land. Within her first 2 weeks, she had assessed the East Field with a farmer's eye and told Cole exactly what the winter wheat needed and when it needed it. She was right. She reorganized the root cellar with a logic that made Cole embarrassed to think about what he had called a system before. She negotiated with the feed merchant in town with a directness that left him momentarily speechless and ultimately got Cole a considerably better rate on grain. She was also, as she had promised him, stubborn and opinionated. They argued about the south pasture within the first week. She thought rotating the cattle would prevent overgrazing. He thought his current system was adequate, and the argument was conducted with the kind of energetic specificity that means two people are taking each other seriously. She cited her father's practices in Missouri. He cited 3 years of cattle experience. She asked for a 2-week trial. He agreed, somewhat ungraciously. She was right. He told her so, directly and without qualification, and the look she gave him then was different from anything he had seen from her before, pure and surprised and warm, all at once. "Most men wouldn't have admitted that," she said. "Most men would have been wrong and needed to hide it," he said. "I'd rather be right eventually than comfortable immediately." She studied him with that searching gaze. "Where did you come from, Cole Hadley?" she said, and it didn't seem to be a question that required an answer, but rather an expression of something she was beginning to feel. Their evenings became the anchor of the day. After supper, which she prepared with a competence that made meals something to anticipate rather than simply fuel. They would sit by the fire, her with mending or occasionally a book she'd borrowed from a leaner Dobbins, him with the ranch ledgers or whatever needed his attention, and they would talk. Sometimes at great length, sometimes barely at all, but always with the ease of people who have found that another person's presence is a comfort rather than a demand. He learned that she had a quick, dry wit that emerged when she was comfortable, that she knew more poetry than he would have expected and was slightly embarrassed about it, that she was afraid of very little except losing the people she loved, that she made her best decisions early in the morning and her worst ones in the hour before supper, and that when she was troubled she went out to the garden even in November, when there was nothing in it, and stood there in the cold, looking at the turned earth until she had sorted herself out. She learned that he was a man who kept his word with the absolute seriousness of someone who had once been let down by a broken promise, and had decided that was not a thing he would do to another person, that he laughed more easily than his serious face suggested, a real laugh that he gave without apology when something was genuinely funny, that he had a habit of fixing things, not just objects but situations, problems, difficulties in general. That was not about control but about care, that he touched the brim of his hat when he was moved by something he didn't have words for, that when he looked at her, really looked at her, it was with the kind of attention that made her feel entirely seen. It was Clara who said it first in November, standing in Margaret's kitchen helping dry dishes after a Sunday dinner that Cole had invited them all to, Thomas and Nora and Clara, a proper meal around the big table. "You're in love with him," Clara said, with the calm certainty of someone reporting something that has been obvious for some time. Margaret dropped a spoon. "I am not in," she started. "The way you looked at him when he was telling that story about the horse, about the one that wouldn't be broken. I was listening to the story." "You were watching his hands," Clara said. "Every time he talks about something he cares about, he talks with his hands a little. You've noticed that, you've been watching for it." Margaret picked up the spoon and dried it with rather more attention than it warranted. "He's my husband," she said. "He is," Clara agreed pleasantly. "And you're in love with him." "You're insufferable," Margaret said. "Also true," Clara said, "but not relevant." That night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet and the fire was low, Cole was banking the coals and Margaret was standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, and she said, "Cole." He looked up. She had the expression she wore when she was making a decision, that focused, deliberate look, the lifted chin, the settled weight of someone who has thought something through. "I want you to know that she stopped and tried again. "This has been another stop. You are not what I expected," she finished, which was not what she had meant to say but was, perhaps, more honest. He put down the poker and turned to face her fully. In the firelight she was very beautiful. He had been aware of that since the night he first saw her, but it had been somehow separate from everything else he was learning about her. And now it was all one thing, her face and her stubbornness and her competence and her grief and the way she almost smiled, and the way she made him feel both settled and more alive than he had in years. He crossed the room, not hurried. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "You are not what I expected either," he said. "You are considerably better than anything I thought to expect." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against his face, his rough, tanned, weathered face, and he turned slightly into it the way that is entirely involuntary, and she said, "I think I am in love with you, Cole Hadley, and I'm not sure whether to be pleased or terrified about it." "I've been in love with you since the third day," he said. "I've been managing my own terror about it ever since." She laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first one he had heard from her, and it was the most extraordinary thing, and he kissed her then, properly, the way a first real kiss should be, slow and certain and warm with all the intention in the world. Outside, the November wind moved through the pecan trees, and the cattle shifted in the south pasture, and the creek ran on in the dark. And inside the old farmhouse on 300 acres of Texas land, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances discovered that unlikely does not mean wrong. December came in hard and bright, with frost on the ground and ice lacing the edges of the creek by morning. The ranch work shifted with the season, less pasture management, more hay and feed, checking the herd in the cold hours of early morning. Cole and Margaret worked together in the way that had become natural to them now, with the economy of motion of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She brought him coffee in the barn without being asked on the mornings when she could see from the kitchen window that he'd been out since before first light. He brought her a second coat without comment on the mornings. She'd gone to the garden in just her house dress to stand among the frost-edged beds and think. They were happy in a way that was not loud but was entirely real, the way happiness often is when it has been come by honestly rather than easily. But Douglas Webb had not forgotten October. He showed up on a December morning when Cole was in town at the general store, and Margaret was at the ranch with only Thomas for company. Thomas was in the barn when the sound of hooves brought him to the door, and he saw Webb and two of his men come into the yard, with the unhurried confidence of people who believed the ground they were standing on had no power to resist them. Margaret came out of the house onto the porch. She had been baking and there was flour on her hands, which she wiped on her apron with a briskness that suggested she was already deciding how to handle this. "Mrs. Hadley," Webb said from his horse, not bothering to dismount. He looked at her with the evaluating appraisal she recognized from the saloon. "I've come to discuss some business with your husband." "He's not here," she said. "I know," Webb said, and his tone made the knowledge unpleasant. Thomas had come out of the barn by now, standing at its entrance, watching. "You can come back when he is," Margaret said. "I'd rather talk to you," Webb said. "I think you and I understand each other, Mrs. Hadley. I think you understand that your husband has some survey questions about his eastern fence line, and I think you understand that those questions could go in his favor or against, depending on how cooperative people decide to be." Thomas had begun walking toward the house. "My husband's survey markers are straight and legal," Margaret said, and her voice was entirely steady. "I've read the deed and the survey myself. If you have a contrary claim, take it to the county land office and make it in writing." Webb looked at her with the slow smile of a man recalibrating his assessment. "You're a particular kind of woman," he said. "I am," she agreed. "The particular kind that is going to ask you to leave my property now." Thomas arrived at the porch steps and stood there, not speaking, simply present. He was armed, as working ranch hands generally were, though he had not reached for anything. Webb looked at Thomas, then back at Margaret, and the slow smile flattened. "You tell your husband I came by," he said. "He knows what it means." He turned his horse and left, and his men followed. Thomas looked at Margaret. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was even, her hands were steady. But when she went back inside, she stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the yard where the hoofprints were already freezing into the frost. Cole came home at midday, and she told him immediately, plainly, without dramatizing but without minimizing. He listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, and when she was finished, he sat for a moment at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold. "He's been making trouble about the eastern fence since I arrived," he said. "There's a strip of land he claims runs with his grant but which the survey says is mine. He's been making noise about it, but it's noise." "He came here because you were not here," Margaret said. "He thought I would be easier to intimidate." Cole looked at her with an expression that mixed pride with something protective and heated. "How'd that work for him?" "Poorly," she said, and now she was almost smiling. "Margaret," Cole said, and waited until she looked at him directly. "I'm sorry he came here. I should have dealt with this more directly before now." "I can hold my ground," she said. "I know you can," he said, "but you shouldn't have to hold it against a man who ought not to be on this property at all. Let me handle Webb." She looked at him for a moment, not because she needed to be persuaded, but because she was making sure she understood what he meant by handling it. Cole was not a man who handled things with violence if there was another way. She had understood that about him early. "How?" she asked. "I'm going to get that survey properly filed with the county this week and the boundaries officially recorded," he said. "That takes the legal argument away from him. And then I'm going to have a private conversation with Webb about what happens to men who come to a man's home and speak to his wife the way he apparently spoke to you. The private conversation is going to involve some level of threat, I assume," she said. "Some level," he agreed. "Be careful," she said, and the simplicity of it, not a command, not a demand, just those two words with everything behind them, made him get up from the table and cross the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kiss her forehead. "I'll be very careful," he said, "because I have reasons to be." She put her hands briefly over his. "Go file the survey," she said, practical to the last. The county land office matter was settled within the week. The survey was filed, the boundaries recorded, and the eastern fence line confirmed as Hadley property by 3 different sets of documentation. The county land agent, who was a different and considerably more honest man than Gerald Peck, made it clear to Douglas Webb in whatever private capacity land agents use that pursuing the eastern parcel further would be a waste of everyone's time. The private conversation Cole had with Webb took place one evening outside the saloon, under the cold December stars, and though neither Cole nor Webb ever reported exactly what was said, Webb was seen to look considerably less comfortable afterward than he had before, and he made no further visits to the Hadley ranch. Salvation Creek concluded, with the collective wisdom of a community that has watched human nature carefully for several years, that Cole Hadley was a man you could pick a fight with if you were determined to, but you should expect to lose it. Christmas arrived with a quiet snowfall, rare enough in that part of Texas to feel like a gift, and they celebrated it at the ranch with Thomas and Nora and Clara and the Dobbins family, with a table crowded with food and a fire that heated the whole main room. Cole had found in the general store a book of botanical illustrations that he thought Margaret would like, knowing her interest in growing things, and he gave it to her after Christmas dinner when the others were occupied. She opened it slowly, looking at each illustration with the concentrated pleasure of someone receiving exactly what they wanted. Then she looked up at him. "How did you know?" she said. "You touch plants differently than other people do," he said, "like they're worth attending to." She laughed softly and kissed him, quickly and warmly, and from across the room Clara watched with the expression of a woman whose assessment has been thoroughly confirmed and who feels vindicated. Clara, for her part, had settled into the foreman's cabin with genuine happiness. She had found work helping Eleanor Dobbins 3 mornings a week and had made friends with several of the younger women in town. She had begun, cautiously and without her sister's knowledge, to correspond with a young schoolteacher in the next county who had come to Salvation Creek for a church social in November, and had been unable to stop thinking about the bright-eyed girl with the freckled nose he'd met there. Margaret found out about this in January and spent an afternoon expressing to Cole, with great precision and energy, her concerns about Clara corresponding with a man she barely knew, while simultaneously acknowledging, when pressed, that this was arguably similar to how she herself had come to be married. Cole listened to all of this with the patience of a man who has learned when to let something run its course and then said, "Do you want to know what I think?" "Not really," she said, which meant yes. "I think Clara is as capable of knowing her own mind as you are, and I think you would be the first person to tell someone else that." Margaret pressed her lips together in the expression she wore when she was aware she was wrong and was deciding whether to admit it. "I would," she said eventually, "tell someone else that." "Right," he said gently. "She's still my little sister," Margaret said. "She is," he agreed. "And she has your sense, which is considerable. Let her use it." The look she gave him was complicated in the way that feelings about siblings are always complicated: love and protectiveness, and the specific grief of watching someone you have always looked after begin to look after themselves. Then she nodded, once, in the way she had of making a final decision. "He'd better be a good man," she said. "If he's not," Cole said, "we'll know in time. He turned out to be a good man. His name was Henry Marsh, and when he came to Salvation Creek in March to formally call on Clara, Cole liked him within an hour and Margaret came around within a day and a half, which was faster than Cole had expected. Henry Marsh was steady and kind and thought Clara Ellison was the finest person he had ever met, which was evident in every interaction, and Margaret finally surrendered to the evidence. But the story of that winter and the spring that followed it belongs primarily to Cole and Margaret, and the life they were building on those 300 acres, and the way that life was filling out with the particular richness that comes from two people who are genuinely suited to each other discovering, day by day, how true that is. By February, Margaret was working the kitchen garden planning in earnest, sketching out what she intended to plant and when, ordering seeds through the general store, and talking Cole through the crop rotation she had planned for the east field. He had learned by now that the best thing he could do with these conversations was listen carefully and ask intelligent questions, and she was always pleased when he asked intelligent questions. He could see it in the way her eyes sharpened with interest. He took her out to the east field one February morning, when the ground was still hard, but the sky had the first pale suggestion of coming spring, and he showed her where he thought the best soil was, and she crouched down in her coat and dress and gloves and picked up a handful of earth and crumbled it in her fingers with her eyes half closed, the way he had described to her father in his mind. "Good," she said to the soil as much as to him. "We can work with this." "I had hoped you'd say that," he said. She stood and brushed her gloved hands together and looked at him with the full warmth she had gradually stopped working to contain. "You know," she said, "when I left Missouri I thought my life was essentially over. I thought the best I could hope for was to find something bearable." He waited. "This is not bearable," she said. "This is good. This is genuinely, surprisingly good, and I want you to know I am aware of that." He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair that had blown across her face back behind her ear, and she let him, looking up at him in the February light with those warm brown eyes that he had loved since before he fully understood he was loving them. "I want you to know I am aware of it too," he said. Spring came to Salvation Creek the way it generally does in that part of Texas, suddenly and with great conviction. The pecan trees leafed out in April, new and bright green, and the kitchen garden that Margaret had planned through the long winter months went into the ground with her hands directing and often performing the work herself, with Cole beside her when the ranch work allowed, and Clara coming out on weekends to help. The east field of winter wheat came up well and was harvested in early summer, and Cole stood at the edge of it in June watching Margaret walk through the rows with her hand trailing across the heads of grain, and he thought that he could look at this image for the rest of his life and not feel anything but grateful. He told her this at supper. She looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "You're becoming romantic, Cole Hadley." "I've always been romantic," he said. "I've been hiding it behind practical behavior." "I've noticed it leaking through," she said dryly, but her eyes were warm. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set down her fork and gave him her full attention. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not content, not managing, happy. She considered it with the seriousness she gave to real questions. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." She paused. "I am also something else, which I was going to wait a little longer to tell you, but since you're asking direct questions," he watched her. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. The silence that followed was entirely different from the silence in the saloon on that October night. This one was warm and still and full, the kind of silence that holds something so large it needs a moment to be real. Cole put down his own fork very carefully. He looked at his wife, a woman who had walked into his life under impossible circumstances and had filled it so completely that he could not now imagine it without her, and his chest did something complicated and tremendous. "Margaret," he said. "I know," she said, and her voice was steady and gentle with all the things they had built between them. "I know." He came around the table and she stood to meet him and he held her carefully and completely, and she put her face against his chest and closed her eyes and breathed. "Your father would have liked this," he said quietly into her hair. She tightened her hands briefly in his coat. "He would have liked you," she said. "He liked men who were honest about what they didn't know and clear about what they cared about." "That is," Cole said, "almost exactly how I try to be." "Almost exactly," she agreed, with the ghost of a smile against his chest. The news spread through the small circle of their people with the warmth that good news generates, Nora cried, predictably and without embarrassment. Thomas said, "Good," which was extensive for Thomas. Clara hugged her sister for a long time and then made a face at Cole over Margaret's shoulder that was simultaneously congratulatory and a complex emotional communication that he interpreted, broadly, as meaning she was happy and that he'd better take care of her sister. He had every intention of doing exactly that. The summer of 1875 was hot in the way that Texas summers are hot genuinely, committedly hot, without apology or relief until October. And Cole was careful about how much time Margaret spent in the fields and how much water she drank and whether she had shade when she needed it, which she found alternately touching and excessive. "I am not made of glass," she told him in August, when he had come to the garden with a second hat because the one she was wearing seemed insufficient. "I know that," he said. "You are made of something considerably tougher, but the baby might be a bit more fragile at this point." She took the hat, examining it. "This is your hat. I have another." "Cole, this is your good hat." "You are my wife," he said simply. She put on the hat, which was too big and settled over her ears at an angle, and the expression she wore with it, fond and exasperated and deeply affectionate, was one he intended to remember for a very long time. August also brought a visitor that neither of them had expected. A woman arrived in Salvation Creek on the noon stage, a handsome woman in her mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that suggested she'd traveled from somewhere more established than the frontier, with the kind of composed manner that comes from a life of managing difficult situations gracefully. She asked for directions to the Hadley ranch at the general store, and Ray Sutter gave them without asking too many questions. She arrived at the ranch at mid-afternoon when Cole was in the barn and Margaret was in the kitchen. Margaret saw her from the kitchen window and went to the door, and the two women looked at each other across the front porch. "You must be Margaret Hadley," the woman said. "I am," Margaret said. "My name is Eleanor Hadley," the woman said. "Cole is my brother." Cole, who had heard the wagon and come out of the barn, arrived at this point with the expression of a man who has walked into a surprise that requires rapid recalibration. "Ellie," he said. His sister looked at him with a combination of exasperation and relief that contained about 5 years' worth of unaddressed communication. "You've been out here 6 months and you wrote me exactly twice," she said. "I wrote you 3 times," he said. "The third letter was 3 lines. It covered the essential points." "Cole," she looked at him with the specific patience of an older sibling who has been managing their younger one's emotional underreporting for decades. "You got married." "I did," he said. "And you thought 3 lines covered that adequately." He had the grace to look briefly abashed. Eleanor Hadley was there for 2 weeks, which turned out to be exactly the right amount of time. She was warm and direct, with Cole's same quality of attention and his same habit of saying what was true even when it was complicated. She and Margaret took to each other with the ease of women who recognize a shared orientation toward the world. And Cole watched the 2 most important women in his life have long conversations at the kitchen table from which he was not exactly excluded, but which clearly functioned at a level that didn't particularly require him. She told Margaret things about Cole's growing up, not embarrassing things, not cruel ones, but the important ones, the ones that explained certain habits and choices, and the particular shape of his kindness. She told her about their parents and the farm they'd grown up on, and how Cole had been the child who fixed things, who always came home with a broken bird or a lame dog, and nursed it back to health or quietly grieved when he couldn't. "He has always taken care of things he loves," Eleanor told Margaret, with a directness that made Margaret quiet for a moment. "I know," Margaret said, Eleanor looked at her with eyes the same color as her brother's. "And people," she said. "Are you letting him take care of you as well as you're taking care of this ranch?" Margaret considered this seriously. "I'm working on that," she said. "I'm not very practiced at being taken care of." "None of us Hadleys are," Eleanor said. "We tend to handle things ourselves, but he's better when he has someone to handle things with rather than for. The difference matters to him." "I've noticed that," Margaret said. "He doesn't want to manage me. He wants to work alongside me." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Exactly that." When Eleanor left in September, she hugged Cole on the front porch for a long moment and then said quietly, enough that only he could hear, "She's remarkable, Cole." "I know," he said. "You looked at her the same way you looked at that broken-winged hawk when you were 12, right before you nursed it back to health and it flew away, just that total focus." "She's not a broken-winged hawk," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "She's a hawk that landed on her own and you had the sense to stand very still and earn her trust. That's different. That's better." She left him with that, and he stood in the front yard watching the wagon until it was out of sight, and then he went inside to where Margaret was finishing the supper preparations and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his face briefly against her hair. "I'm glad she came," he said. "So am I," she said. "Your sister is extraordinary. She'd say the same of you." "She did," Margaret said, and her voice was warm. "Several times. The autumn came around again, a full year from the night in the saloon, from the gavel and the silence and the decision that had changed everything, and the ranch looked different from how it had a year ago. The kitchen garden had been harvested and put to bed with care. The east field of winter wheat was planted again, in the rotation Margaret had designed. The cattle herd had grown to 78 head. The south pasture was healthy and unovergrazed. There was a new fence along the northern creek bottom that Cole had built himself over the course of 2 weekends in August, Margaret bringing lunch out to the fence line and staying to hold posts while he drove them. The foreman's cabin where Clara lived had been given a new window and a proper wooden floor, which Cole had insisted on and Margaret had supervised. Clara herself was the subject of intense happy discussion, because Henry Marsh had come to ask formally for Clara's hand in September, and Cole and Margaret had sat across the kitchen table from him, while he made his case with the earnest sincerity of a man who understood the weight of what he was asking. Clara had married Henry in October, a wedding at the Salvation Creek Church with considerably less emergency about it than the one the previous year, and considerably more flowers because Margaret had grown them herself. The ceremony was simple and glad, and at the reception afterward Margaret held Cole's hand through most of it, which she had never been much in the habit of doing in public, and he held hers back. "This time last year," she said, quietly, standing at the edge of the celebration. "I know," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I was holding Clara's hand in that awful saloon, and I was the most frightened I have ever been in my life, and I was trying not to show it." "You didn't show it," he said. "You showed something else entirely." "What did I show?" He looked at her, his blue eyes steady and warm. "You showed that whatever happened, you were going to handle it, and that whoever you were going to have to deal with, you were going to look them straight in the eye." She thought about that. "And then you walked across the room." "And then I walked across the room," he agreed. "I thought you were the most alarming man I had ever seen," she said. "Alarming." "You said what you said, and the whole room went quiet, and you were looking at me like I was the only thing in the room, which was—" she paused. "I thought this man is either the most dangerous man I have ever met or the safest one, and I had about 30 seconds to decide which." "Which did you decide?" he asked. She looked up at him. "I decided I was willing to find out, which was, for me, practically the same as saying safe." He touched her face gently because they were in a room full of people and he was still a private man, and she leaned into it slightly, which she had gradually allowed herself to do. "I'm glad you decided that," he said. "So am I," she said. "Every day I am so glad I decided that." Their son was born on the 23rd of November, 1875, in the bedroom of the ranch house on 300 acres of Texas land, with Nora Reeves and the town's doctor both in attendance, and Cole sitting just outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with his hat in his hands, which he would have been embarrassed about if there had been anyone to see it. Thomas sat with him for the last 2 hours, not saying anything, which was perfectly appropriate. When the doctor opened the door and told Cole he could come in, Cole went through it with the careful speed of a man who is trying not to run. Margaret was tired in the deep, complete way of enormous effort accomplished, her dark hair loose on the pillow, but she was looking up at him with those warm brown eyes when he came in, and in them there was something incandescent, something past happiness into a country that didn't have a name. She was holding their son. He was very small and very red and absolutely perfect. "Come meet him," Margaret said. Cole sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and his son looked back at him with the unfocused but somehow serious gaze of the very newly arrived. "He looks at things carefully," Cole said, very quietly. "He gets that from you," Margaret said. "He has your chin," Cole said. "God help him," she said, and her voice held a warmth that was also a full year of learning to love someone. They named him Richard, for Margaret's father, and the name settled onto the boy as naturally as if it had been waiting there all along. The ranch that Richard Ellison Hadley came home to was a different place from the one his father had ridden into a year and a half earlier, not in its geography but in its character. It was lived in now, fully and deeply. The kitchen had proper pans, and a Dutch oven and herbs hanging from the rafters that filled the air with the smell of rosemary and sage. The main room had books along the shelf Cole had built in the spring, and a rag rug Nora had made, and a rocking chair that Margaret used in the evenings. Outside, the kitchen garden had been put properly to bed under straw mulch for the winter, patient as a promise. The south pasture was green and rested. The creek ran along the northern edge, cold and clear in the November air. Winter settled around them, and it was not harsh that year. One of those merciful Texas winters that is cold but not brutal, with the occasional snowfall that was beautiful more than punishing. Margaret healed steadily, which she did with the same focus she brought to everything, and by December she was moving through her days with most of her usual energy. Cole took the night waking without complaint, getting up in the dark, cold hours to bring the baby to Margaret and sitting in the rocking chair while she fed him and sometimes falling asleep there himself. And she would watch his sleeping face in the lamplight and think about the particular miracle of ending up here, in this life, with this man. She told him that once, in early December in the small, quiet hours of the night, when the baby had gone back to sleep, and Cole was half asleep in the rocking chair. "Cole," she said softly. He opened his eyes, alert from long practice with livestock in early mornings. "I was just thinking," she said, "that I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Not in the way that I depend on you for practical things, though I appreciate that. In the way that I cannot imagine being fully myself without someone to be it next to. And you are that person. You became that person somewhere in the first month, and I was too afraid to say so for a very long time." He looked at her in the lamplight, the baby sleeping between them, the ranch quiet outside and the fire low and warm. "I know exactly when it happened for me," he said. "The third day. You were arguing with me about the south pasture, and you picked up a handful of soil and you held it up between us like it was evidence in a courtroom." She laughed quietly, careful of the sleeping baby. "That's when you fell in love with me, when I was arguing with you." "You were right," he said. "You knew you were right, and you were making your case without apology, and I thought." He stopped, and she watched him search for the right words, which he found with the same care he brought to building a fence that would last. "I thought, I want to spend my life trying to be worthy of that standard." She reached across and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair. "You are more than worthy of it," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I." The Christmas of 1875 was crowded in the best way. Clara and Henry came out from town, and Thomas and Nora and the Dobbins family, and Eleanor Hadley had made the journey again from Kansas, which made Cole light up in a way that Margaret stored carefully in the collection of things she loved about him. The table was extended with the spare board Cole had cut for the purpose, and there was more food than they could reasonably eat, and Richard slept through most of it in a cradle Cole had built himself in November, from pecan wood, with joints so smooth and precise that Thomas had examined them and said, "Good," which was the highest praise in his vocabulary. After the guests had gone and Clara and Henry were settled in the foreman's cabin for the holiday, and Alina was in the spare room, Cole and Margaret sat together by the fire in the quiet. Richard was asleep. The house was warm and full of the smell of pine and good food. Outside, the stars were out in the enormous Texas way, millions of them spread across a black sky that went on forever. "Tell me something," Margaret said, the way she did in evenings when she wanted a real conversation. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "What do you want?" she said. "Not the ranch, not the cattle or the crops. What do you want from this life?" He considered it seriously as she had asked it seriously. "This," he said. "What is in this house right now?" "More of it, for as long as we can have it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had become more accustomed to doing, the gradual ease of a woman who has learned that being held is not being diminished. "More of it," she agreed. "More seasons on this land, more arguments about pasture rotation. More of you knowing you're right and making your case without apology," he said. "More of you admitting when I am," she returned. "Always," he said. "I will always tell you when you're right." She tilted her face up to his. "Do you know that is one of the genuinely rare things about you? Admitting I'm wrong, telling me I'm right," she said, "without it costing you anything, without it feeling like a concession. You just say it. You are right with some frequency," he said. "It would be exhausting to resist the evidence." She kissed him, warm and unhurried, the way people kiss when they have time and intention, and the assurance that there will be more of this. When a kiss is not a hope but a certainty. Spring came back around in 1876 with the confidence of things that know their own rhythm. The kitchen garden went in with an expanded plan. Margaret had added 3 new beds over the winter on paper, and now translated them into earth, moving through the turned soil with the satisfaction of someone who has planned something well and is now enacting it. Cole watched her from the fence where he was doing repair work, the way the April light hit the dark hair she had left loosely braided down her back, the way she moved with the ease of someone who belongs to a place. Clara had news in March that made Margaret cry in the kitchen, and then pretend she hadn't been crying, which Clara saw through immediately, and the news was that Clara and Henry were expecting their first child in the fall. The 2 sisters sat together on the porch of the ranch house that Sunday afternoon, while Cole and Henry discussed cattle in the yard below in the way men discuss things when they are actually discussing themselves. And Margaret held her sister's hand and Clara leaned her head on her sister's shoulder, and neither of them said much, but everything was said. The Hadley cattle herd reached 107 head by May, a milestone Cole marked by standing at the pasture fence for a considerable time looking at the grazing animals, with the quiet pleasure of a man who has built something from a smaller thing. Margaret came to stand beside him with 2 cups of coffee and gave him one, and he took it without looking away from the pasture. "You're counting them," she said. "I am," he said. "You've counted them twice this morning." "3 times," he said. She laughed, and he finally looked at her, and the look was the kind that she had collected over nearly 2 years now, that full, direct attention that had startled her in a saloon on the night everything changed, and which had not dimmed or diminished in the slightest with time. Richard Ellison Hadley was 8 months old, and had discovered the great pleasure of pulling himself upright by gripping anything stable enough to bear his weight, which included the pecan tree at the garden's edge, his father's boot, and the patient dog that Thomas's youngest son had given Cole in February as a welding and christening gift simultaneously. The dog was a large, amiable creature of uncertain heritage called simply Dog, which Richard called something that sounded like duh, creating occasional confusion that Cole found funny and that Margaret endured with patience. They were, in the fullest possible sense of the word, a family. The town of Salvation Creek had long since made its peace with the Hadley marriage, and indeed had come to regard it as one of the better stories to emerge from the general unpredictability of frontier life. Margaret had become involved in the small school that served the town's children, advising on the kitchen garden. The school was trying to establish and contributing seeds from her own stock. Cole served on the informal committee of property owners that dealt with issues like road maintenance and water rights. Doing so with the same plain-spoken directness he brought to everything and earning the respect of men who valued people who said what they meant and meant what they said. Gerald Peck had left Salvation Creek in February of 1875. No one was entirely sure where, and this was regarded by most of the town as an improvement. Douglas Webb had eventually sold his ranch and moved north, which the community received with similar equanimity. Reverend Dobbins performed the christening of Richard Hadley in January of 1876 with great warmth and the observation, in his sermon, that there are passages in every life that seem at first like ends and are in fact beginnings, and that wisdom lies in recognizing which is which before too much time has passed. Cole and Margaret sat in the front pew with Richard in Cole's arms and Clara and Henry behind them, and Thomas and Nora and Eleanor, who had come again, making the journey with the cheerful determination of a woman who intends to be present for the important things. And the whole of this small, good life was gathered in one place. Summer deepened and brought with it the kind of days that are long and hot and enormously productive. Cole and his hands, he had two now, in addition to Thomas, a pair of brothers from the hill country who were good workers and good-natured, managed the herd through the heat with practiced efficiency. Margaret's garden produced with the abundance of well-tended land, and she was selling vegetables to the general store by July, which she had proposed to Cole in the spring, and which he had agreed to without hesitation, and which had made Ray Sutter very happy and several Salvation Creek households considerably better fed. In August, Clara and Henry Marsh's daughter was born, and they named her Margaret, which made the elder Margaret stand in the Marsh kitchen doorway and breathe very carefully for a moment before she said anything. "Clara," she said. "I know," Clara said from the bed, holding her daughter with the tired, triumphant expression of the newly delivered. "You named her Margaret." "Our father always said it was the best name he could think of," Clara said. "I thought he was right." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at her sister and did not say anything for a while, but Clara had known her for 23 years and needed no words. Henry Marsh, standing in the corner of the room with the look of a man who has just witnessed something enormous and is in the process of understanding it, met Cole's eyes in the doorway, and they exchanged the glance of men who have both made good decisions and know it. The autumn of 1876 settled over the ranch with the gold and copper grandeur that was its particular annual gift. The pecan trees dropped their nuts in October, and Margaret organized the harvest with the efficiency of a general, enlisting Cole and Thomas and the two ranch hands and Clara and Henry, and producing, by the end of a Saturday, more pecans than any of them knew what to do with, which she then did very specific things with over the following weeks involving pies and preserves and baked goods that became legendary in Salvation Creek. On the evening of the 14th of October, which was the second anniversary of the night in the saloon, Cole came in from the evening work to find the kitchen table set properly and candles lit, which Margaret did not generally do on weekday evenings, and a meal that had clearly been made with intention. He washed and came to the table, and she poured the coffee, and he looked at the date he had already been thinking about all day. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she agreed. "How does the accounting look from where you're standing?" he said. She considered it with the full weight she gave to real questions. She looked at the kitchen around her, the herbs on the rafters, the good pots, the light warm and steady. She thought of the garden outside, put to bed now for winter. She thought of Richard asleep in the next room, 8 months deep into the business of being alive and approaching it with the same focused attention that his father brought to everything. She thought of Clara's baby named for her, and the school garden, and the 107 cattle in the south pasture, and the pecan grove full of golden light. She looked at Cole across the kitchen table. His face was the face she had looked at for 2 years with increasing knowledge and increasing love, the blue eyes, the weathered skin, the hands that fixed things and held things and reached for her without apology. The man who had walked across a saloon floor and changed her life with 5 words. "The accounting," she said, "is extraordinary. I don't say that easily, as you know." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." "I came here with nothing," she said. "I came here frightened and grieving, and standing in the worst room I could have imagined with my sister holding my hand. And I had nowhere to go and no certainty of anything good." And now she gestured gently at the room around them, at the life that was in it. "Now I have a home. I have this land that I love. I have work that means something. I have my sister close. I have a son." She paused. "And I have you, which is the thing that makes all the other things possible, not because I couldn't manage without you. I could. I would figure it out. That's who I am. But because having you makes me more myself, not less. And that is rarer than land or cattle or a good harvest. That is the rarest thing there is." Cole was quiet for a moment, looking at her with everything he had. "I walked into that saloon to talk to a land agent about a survey dispute," he said. "I had no intention of changing my life that evening." "I know," she said. "And then I saw you standing there with your chin up and your sister's hand in yours and the whole room making you into something you weren't, and I thought." He stopped, and she waited because she had learned that Cole Hadley's pauses meant something was being said precisely. "I thought, I don't know that woman, but I know what she deserves, and it isn't this." "And so you walked across the room," she said. "And so I walked across the room," he said. "It was possibly the least calculated thing I have ever done." "It was possibly," she said, "the best thing anyone has ever done for me." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen of the life they had built, while the candles burned and the pecan trees stood outside in the dark and the creek ran along the northern edge of the land and the cattle rested in the pasture and their son slept in the next room with his whole life ahead of him. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something I don't say often enough." He waited. "Thank you," she said, "not just for that night. For every day since. For the way you look at me. For the way you argue with me when you think you're right. For the way you admit it when I am. For the way you held Thomas Reeves's horse through that January storm. For the way you sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours when Richard was born. For the way you built that cradle from pecan wood. For all of it." "Margaret," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I want you to hear it plainly." "I hear you," he said. "And I'll tell you just as plainly, being loved by you is the great privilege of my life. Everything I have done to earn even a fraction of what you have brought to this." He shook his head, and the feeling was bigger than the words, and they both knew it. "I just want more of it," he said. "More years of it, more seasons, more arguments about crop rotation. More children, perhaps," she said, and the something in her voice made him look at her sharply. She was watching him with the expression she wore on the mornings she had important things to say, that settled, certain look. "Margaret," he said. "Spring," she said. "If my reading of things is correct, which it generally is." He stood from the table and came around to her in a single motion, and she stood to meet him, and he held her the way he had on the night she told him about Richard, carefully and completely. "A spring baby," he said. "A spring baby," she confirmed against his chest. Outside, the October night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the town of Salvation Creek settled into its evening, and the Hadley Ranch sat solid and permanent on its 300 acres, with its creek and its pecan trees and its pastures and its kitchen garden, and the two people at the center of it stood in the warm light of their kitchen holding each other, as if they were the still point around which the whole world turned, which in the geography of their life they were. The spring child was a boy, born in March of 1877, with a great deal of announcing his own arrival, a child who seemed, from the first hours, to have opinions about things and was not shy about expressing them. They named him James, and he had Margaret's brown eyes and Cole's jaw and apparently the combined stubbornness of both parents at full strength, which Nora Reeves, present at the birth, and in a position to assess the situation clearly, said meant he was going to be an absolute handful and a complete joy. She was right on both counts. Richard, who was a year and a half old by the time James arrived, received his brother with the cautious interest of someone confronting a new piece of information and not yet sure what category it belongs in. Within a week he had decided James was acceptable, and within a month he had appointed himself a guardian of such determined sincerity that Cole and Margaret frequently had to address the problem of Richard attempting to oversee James's activities with more authority than was strictly warranted. Clara's daughter, the small Margaret, was beginning to walk by then and was conducting herself with a confidence that made both her mother and her aunt laugh. Henry Marsh had been offered the position of schoolteacher in Salvation Creek, the previous teacher having departed for California, and had accepted, which meant that Clara and the baby moved closer to town while remaining within easy visiting distance of the ranch. Thomas Reeves retired from full-time ranch work in the summer of 1877, though he continued to come out twice a week with the manner of a man who is doing everyone a favor by being available. Cole hired a full-time foreman named Aaron Diaz, who had worked cattle drives for 8 years and had come to Salvation Creek with the intention of staying in one place for a while. Aaron was 30 years old, methodical and reliable, and he and Cole developed a working partnership built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that good cattle work was serious business done by serious men. The Hadley Ranch grew. Not in the dramatic overnight way of speculation or luck, but in the solid, incremental way of people who work their land with knowledge and care and wake up one morning to find that a great deal has been built, like a tree grown from a seed you planted years ago and tended through every season. By the autumn of 1877, the herd was at 140. The wheat field produced a good harvest 2 years running. The kitchen garden had expanded to the point where Margaret was supplying not just the general store, but the school and the Reverend's household as well. Cole had begun talking about adding another pasture on the western edge of the property, running fence along the creek bottom, and he and Margaret had spent several evenings with the property map spread on the kitchen table, her hand tracing possible lines and him making notes in the ledger. On one such evening, with the lamp casting its warm circle over the map in the ledger, and Richard and James both asleep in the bedroom and the house quiet around them, Margaret looked up from the map at Cole, who was frowning thoughtfully at his own handwriting in the way he did when a calculation didn't immediately resolve. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "I want to tell you something I think you should know," she said, in the tone that always made him pay full attention. He put down the pen. 3 years ago," she said, "I was standing in a saloon in Salvation Creek next to my frightened sister, and I was trying to decide if the thing I was most afraid of was what was happening to me or what was about to happen to me. And I was holding myself together with the last of what I had, and I was trying very hard to look like I had more." He waited. "I want you to know that I was not nearly as composed as I appeared," she said. "I want you to know that I was terrified." "I know," he said gently, "but here is the thing," she said. "In all of those 3 years since, in the hard days and the good days and the ordinary days that are somehow better than I ever thought ordinary days could be, I have never once felt alone. Not once. Even when you were across the property and I couldn't see you, I didn't feel alone. And that is," she stopped. "That is," he said. "That is the thing I most wanted from a life," she said, "and had decided I was probably not going to have. And I want you to understand that when you walked across that room on a Tuesday night in October, you gave me exactly that. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it and trying to give it back to you in equal measure." Cole was very still for a moment. Then he said, "You give it back to me every day. You have been giving it back to me since the day you told me I was not what you expected." She laughed softly. "I really did mean it as a compliment." "I took it as one," he said. He reached across the map and the ledger and took her hand in both of his. Outside, the October night had stars from one end of the sky to the other, and the creek ran in the dark, and the cattle grazed in the south pasture, and Clara's light was on in the house in town where she and Henry were reading, and Nora Reeves was baking something because she always was, and Thomas Reeves was asleep in his chair because he always was, and Salvation Creek made its small night noises and breathed its night air, and on 300 acres of Texas land, under that extravagant sky, two people sat at a kitchen table with their hands together over a map of the life they were building, and they were home. They were, without qualification, entirely and completely home. Years later, many years later, in the particular way of stories that have good endings and keep being good, Cole and Margaret would sit on the porch of the ranch house in the long summer evenings with the second cup of coffee and watch Richard, who was by then a young man of serious demeanor and remarkable competence, move through the pasture with the ease of someone who has grown up knowing the land. James, louder and more sociable than his brother but no less capable, would be somewhere audible working in the barn or arguing cheerfully with Aaron Diaz about something or other. Clara's daughter Margaret would be over most Sundays with her own family, because Clara and Henry had built their life close, and the families had wound together in the easy way of people who love each other and choose proximity. There was a granddaughter by then. Richard had married a woman from the next county, a capable, bright-eyed woman named Susanna who had found her match in his serious ways and his steady hands, and their first child was a boy, and the second was a girl they named Clara. The ranch was 450 acres by then. It had grown not by purchase alone but by care, the land producing more than it had when Cole arrived, properly rested and rotated and understood. There was a second barn. There were more hands. There was a school a half-mile up the road that Henry Marsh had taught in for 20 years. In the evenings, Cole and Margaret sat on the porch with their coffee, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they were quiet, and both were equally good. He still touched the brim of his hat when he was moved by something he didn't have words for. She still went to the garden when she needed to think, though the garden was considerably larger than it had been. One particular evening, an October evening, because October was always theirs, ever since the beginning, Margaret set down her cup and looked at the pecan trees, gold in the late light, and said, "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What?" Cole said. "The way the room went quiet," she said, "when you said what you said." He smiled, a real one, full and unhurried. "Which thing?" "You know which thing," she said. He looked at the pecan trees too, at the light through them, at the land that was theirs in every sense that mattered. "I was thinking about you," he said. "That's all I was doing. I walked across a room because I was thinking about you before I had any right to be thinking about you, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made." She reached over without looking at him and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat in the late October light of another year together on the land they had built into a life, and the creek ran beyond the cottonwoods, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the pecan trees dropped their golden leaves one at a time into the warm, still air, and it was good. It was, from beginning to present and forward into the future that waited for them with its ordinary, extraordinary days, simply, completely, and entirely good.